January 1945. Okinawa Prefecture, Japan. The transport ship rocked gently in the harbor as dawn broke across the Pacific, casting long shadows over the deck where 37 Japanese women stood in silence. Their uniforms, stained with mud and blood from weeks of fighting, hung loose on frames hollowed by hunger. Among them was Nurse Corporal Miyako Yamashita, 23 years old, who clutched a small wooden comb her mother had given her before deployment. She had not eaten a full meal in 41 days. Around her neck, hidden beneath her collar, hung a cyanide capsule issued by the Imperial Army, a final mercy, they had called it, to avoid the shame of capture. The women had been told what awaited them: torture, violation, death. The propaganda leaflets distributed by their commanders showed grotesque illustrations of American soldiers as demonic figures. Better to die, they had been instructed, than to fall into enemy hands. When the American Marines stormed their field hospital bunker 3 days earlier, Miyako had reached for the capsule. Her fingers trembled as she brought it to her lips. But before she could bite down, an explosion from a nearby mortar round knocked her unconscious. She awoke to find an American medic, a boy who looked no older than 19, bandaging a shrapnel wound on her leg. He offered her water. She flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, he smiled awkwardly and gestured to his own canteen, taking a sip first to show it was not poison. This small act of humanity bewildered her more than any battle she had witnessed. Now aboard this American vessel bound for internment on the Hawaiian Islands, Miyako and her fellow prisoners waited for their fate. They had been taught that capture meant the end of everything: honor, dignity, life itself. The Imperial military indoctrination had been thorough and relentless. From childhood, Japanese citizens had been saturated with propaganda portraying Americans as barbaric devils who would show no mercy to prisoners. School children practiced mass suicide drills. Soldiers received explicit orders: never surrender, never be taken alive. To be captured was to betray the emperor, to disgrace one's family for generations. Death, they learned, was infinitely preferable to the unspeakable horrors that awaited in American hands. The reality that awaited these women would shatter every certainty they had been taught to believe. The systematic dehumanization of the enemy was not unique to Japan, but the empire had elevated it to a state religion. Throughout the 1930s, as Japan expanded its military campaigns across Asia, the government's propaganda machine worked tirelessly to prepare its population for total war. The thought police monitored citizens for any deviation from approved ideology. Radio broadcasts depicted Americans as racially inferior, spiritually bankrupt, and morally degenerate. Japanese soldiers were shown newsreels of American excess, Hollywood decadence, jazz clubs, women in revealing clothing, presented as evidence of a civilization in terminal decline. How could such a soft, pleasure-seeking people possibly stand against the disciplined might of the Imperial Army? This narrative served multiple purposes. It justified Japan's wars of conquest as a civilizing mission across Asia. It steeled soldiers against the psychological trauma of combat. And critically, it ensured that Japanese military personnel would fight to the death rather than surrender, viewing capture as a fate literally worse than death. By 1945, this indoctrination had become so complete that mass civilian suicides accompanied American advances across the Pacific Islands. On Saipan, hundreds of Japanese civilians threw themselves and their children from cliffs rather than face capture. Mothers drowned their babies in the sea. Old men detonated grenades clutched to their chests. 4 Japanese women serving in military auxiliary roles, nurses, communications operators, comfort station workers. The propaganda was even more explicit about the horrors of capture. They were told that American soldiers would rape them repeatedly before executing them in grotesque ways. Some were given grenades with instructions to use them on themselves if capture became imminent. Others, like Miyako, received cyanide capsules. The message was clear: capture was not an option to be considered or survived. It was an ending to be avoided at all costs. Yet historical records reveal that by early 1945, a strange rumor had begun circulating among Japanese forces in the Pacific. It spread in whispers, in fragments of overheard conversations, in the testimonies of the rare soldier who had been recaptured after briefly falling into American hands. The rumor seemed impossible, almost absurd, that American prisoner of war camps were places of extraordinary comfort and abundance. That captured Japanese soldiers were being fed 3 meals a day, more food than they had seen in months of fighting. That they received medical treatment, clean clothes, beds with mattresses. Some whispered that prisoners were even given chocolate and cigarettes. The Imperial command worked frantically to suppress these rumors, correctly recognizing them as a threat to morale. Officers who spoke of them were reassigned or worse. But the whispers persisted, spreading through the ranks like an underground river. Because the rumors, impossible as they seemed, were true. The POW camp system established by the United States during World War II represented a stark departure from the treatment of prisoners by other major powers. While Nazi Germany's camps for Soviet prisoners saw death rates exceeding 50%, and Japanese camps for Allied prisoners achieved a mortality rate of 27% through starvation, disease, and execution, American POW camps maintained death rates below 1%. This was not accidental. It reflected both adherence to the Geneva Conventions and a calculated strategic decision. Well-treated prisoners were a powerful psychological weapon. They undermined enemy propaganda, encouraged surrender, and provided valuable intelligence. But the American approach went beyond mere compliance with international law. It reflected something deeper about American abundance and ideology, a material reality so overwhelming that it could be weaponized simply by exposing enemy soldiers to it. When Miyako Yamashita and her fellow nurses arrived at the internment facility on Oahu in February 1945, they stepped off the transport ship expecting a descent into hell. Instead, they found themselves confronted with something their training had not prepared them for: abundance. The camp itself was a sprawling complex of wooden barracks surrounded by chain-link fencing, but the conditions inside bore no resemblance to the dungeons of their imagination. Each woman was assigned a bed, an actual mattress on a metal frame, not a bamboo mat on bare ground. They received 2 blankets, a pillow, a set of clean clothes. The barracks had electric lighting. There were latrines with running water. But it was the food that broke through their disbelief most dramatically. That first evening, they were led to a mess hall and served dinner: rice, vegetable stew, fish, bread, canned fruit, and tea. Not prison rations, actual meals, with portions larger than what Japanese soldiers in the field had been receiving for the past year. Miyako stared at her tray in confusion. Was this a trick? Were they being fattened before slaughter? Around her, other women began to weep. Some refused to eat, certain it must be poisoned. But hunger eventually overcame caution, and when no one died or fell ill, the psychological impact was profound. One woman, a former schoolteacher named Keiko Tanaka, who had been drafted into military service as a translator, would later write in her diary, "I could not reconcile what I was experiencing with what I had been taught. We had been told that Americans were demons. But demons do not feed their captives. Demons do not provide medical care. Demons do not allow their prisoners to write letters home." Every day presented new evidence that everything we had been told was a lie. And if that was a lie, what else had been false? The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These women had been prepared for torture and death. Instead, they found themselves in conditions superior to what they had experienced as free citizens in wartime Japan. The camp had a medical clinic where nurses treated their ailments without discrimination. There was a recreation area where they could exercise. They were permitted to form their own internal committees to manage daily affairs. Male privileges allowed them to write home letters that were censored for military information but otherwise unmolested. Most shocking of all, they were paid a small wage for voluntary work details, and this money could be spent at a camp canteen that stocked cigarettes, candy, soap, and other sundries. This was not paradise in any absolute sense. They were prisoners, confined behind wire, separated from their families, living under the authority of an enemy power. But compared to the privations they had endured before capture, compared to the conditions facing Japanese civilians and soldiers still fighting the war, it seemed almost incomprehensibly comfortable. And that very comfort became a weapon more potent than any bomb. The transformation in these women's consciousness did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, in small moments of recognition and readjustment. For months, many remained suspicious, waiting for the cruelty they had been promised to reveal itself. But as weeks turned to months, and the routine of decent treatment continued unbroken, their worldview began to shift. Miyako found herself particularly troubled by the behavior of the American guards. They were young men, most of them barely older than herself. They followed regulations strictly, maintaining the boundary between prisoner and captor, but they were not cruel. They did not strike prisoners or shout abuse. When one of the older women fell ill with pneumonia and required hospitalization, the guards arranged her transport with the same efficiency they would have shown for one of their own. When a typhoon threatened the island and the barracks began to leak, repair crews arrived within hours. These were small things, perhaps, but they accumulated into a weight of evidence that could not be ignored. The psychological impact was compounded by the arrival of care packages from the American Red Cross. These boxes contained items that had become legendary luxuries to Japanese military personnel: chocolate bars, canned meat, powdered milk, soap, toothpaste. But more than the material goods themselves, it was what they represented that shook these women. Some vast organizational apparatus in America, had taken the time and expense to assemble packages for enemy prisoners. In Japan, such concern for enemy welfare would have been incomprehensible. Japanese military culture barely provided for its own soldiers, let alone its prisoners. The contrast was impossible to ignore. A recurring symbol began to appear in the diaries and letters of these female prisoners: chocolate. That small brown bar, wrapped in paper, became a shorthand for everything they were experiencing. Chocolate was luxury, frivolity, excess. It served no nutritional purpose that rice or bread could not fulfill more efficiently. Yet the Americans included it as a matter of course in their rations, even for prisoners. To women who had grown up in a militarized society that demanded sacrifice, austerity, and the subordination of individual pleasure to collective duty, this casual abundance spoke volumes. One nurse, Sachiko Ito, wrote to her sister in Hiroshima, "They give us chocolate as if it were nothing. As if they have so much that even their enemies deserve some. I think about you and Mother rationing your grains to survive, and I eat chocolate given to me by the people we were taught to hate. What kind of nation has so much that it can afford to be generous even to those who fought against it? I no longer know what to believe." This was precisely the effect American military strategists had calculated. Intelligence officers understood that the most effective propaganda was not what you told enemy soldiers, but what you showed them. A well-treated prisoner who eventually returned home or communicated with comrades still fighting was worth a division of troops in terms of psychological impact. Throughout 1945, as the war ground toward its conclusion, American forces made deliberate efforts to ensure that Japanese prisoners were treated well, and that word of their treatment spread. The military published photographs of Japanese POWs playing baseball, eating full meals, receiving medical care. These images were dropped as leaflets over Japanese positions. Radio broadcasts in Japanese described the comfortable conditions in American camps. Initially, Japanese soldiers dismissed this as propaganda. But as more prisoners were taken and more testimony accumulated, the truth became harder to deny. By the summer of 1945, some Japanese units were experiencing unprecedented rates of surrender. Men who had been prepared to die now chose captivity instead. The women in the Hawaiian camp became aware of their role in this psychological operation. They were told that their letters home would help bring the war to a faster conclusion, that their testimony might save lives on both sides. Some resented being used as propaganda tools. Others embraced it, believing that revealing the truth might spare their families and countrymen further suffering. The debates among the prisoners grew heated. Was it collaboration to speak honestly about their treatment? Was it betrayal to acknowledge that the enemy was more humane than their own propaganda had claimed? These questions became more urgent in August 1945, when news of Japan's surrender reached the camp. The women gathered in stunned silence as the announcement was translated. The war, the vast, all-consuming conflict that had defined their entire adult lives, was over. Japan had lost. The divine emperor they had been taught was infallible had submitted to American terms. The Imperial project that had justified every sacrifice and every death had collapsed. For some, this news brought relief. For others, it brought despair and confusion. If the war had been lost, had their service been meaningless? Had their comrades died for nothing? In the weeks following the surrender, American authorities offered the female prisoners a choice: remain in the camp until repatriation to Japan could be arranged, or volunteer for work programs that would allow them greater freedom and the opportunity to earn money. The response surprised camp administrators. More than half volunteered for work programs. They were assigned to various civilian jobs on the island, laundries, hospitals, agricultural facilities, and were paid standard wages. Many sent their earnings home to support families they feared were starving in the ruins of post-war Japan. Miyako Yamashita took a position at a military hospital, working alongside American nurses. The irony was not lost on her. She had trained to save Japanese soldiers, had expected to die for her country, and now found herself caring for American servicemen. The work was difficult and the hours long, but she was no stranger to hardship. What struck her was the casual friendliness of her American colleagues. They invited her to lunch, taught her English slang, showed her photographs of their families back home. They treated her not as a former enemy, but simply as another nurse. One afternoon, a young Marine was brought in with severe burns from a training accident. As Miyako helped change his bandages, he looked up at her and asked in broken Japanese where she was from. When she told him she had been a prisoner of war, his eyes widened. Then he nodded slowly and said, "Must have been scary." That simple acknowledgement, not of her as an enemy or a threat, but as a person who had experienced fear, moved something in her that propaganda and comfort had not quite reached. She realized then that the Americans had never truly seen her as inhuman, even when they were fighting her country. They had been able to separate the individual from the system, the person from the ideology. This was a sophistication her own culture had not permitted. By late 1945, the first groups of female POWs began the journey back to Japan. They returned to a country devastated by firebombing and atomic weapons, where millions faced starvation and cities lay in ruins. The contrast with the abundance they had experienced in American captivity was shocking. Many found their families displaced, their homes destroyed. The Imperial government that had promised them victory and prosperity had delivered only catastrophe. And yet, the American occupation forces now administering Japan seemed determined to feed and rebuild the very nation they had just defeated. The women who returned carried with them a burden of knowledge that set them apart from their countrymen. They had seen behind the curtain of propaganda. They knew that the enemy was not demonic, that American abundance was not a facade, that the values of democracy and individual dignity were not merely decadent weakness. This knowledge complicated their reintegration into Japanese society. Some were shunned as collaborators for speaking positively of their captivity. Others kept silent, understanding that their experiences challenged narratives many Japanese needed to maintain their sense of identity and purpose. But privately, in letters to friends who had shared their captivity, in quiet conversations with family members, the truth emerged. Keiko Tanaka, the former schoolteacher, would eventually write a memoir published in the 1950s titled Paradise Behind Wire. In it, she reflected, "We called the camps paradise not because they were perfect, but because they revealed to us the profound poverty of a world we had come from. Not material poverty alone, though we had certainly known hunger, but poverty of imagination, poverty of compassion, poverty of truth. We had been taught that strength meant cruelty, that honor meant death, that loyalty meant unquestioning obedience. The Americans showed us, often without intending to, that a society could be strong while remaining humane, that true honor included the dignity of every person, that loyalty to principles was more important than loyalty to leaders." The chocolate bar, that simple symbol, appeared one final time in the closing pages of her memoir. Tanaka described receiving a care package shortly before repatriation and finding inside a chocolate bar that she chose to save rather than eat. She carried it with her back to Japan and kept it for months, watching it slowly deteriorate in the humid climate. She never ate it. Instead, she kept it as a reminder of a truth she had learned, that abundance shared is more powerful than scarcity weaponized, that generosity toward enemies can undermine hate more effectively than any battle, that sometimes the most subversive act is simple kindness extended across the lines that divide us. The story of these female Japanese POWs occupies a strange space in the historical memory of World War II. It complicates the clean narratives both sides prefer. For Americans, it serves as evidence of moral superiority. Look how well we treated those who fought against us, even while they treated our prisoners with brutality. But it also reveals the calculated nature of that generosity, the way decency was deployed as a weapon of psychological warfare. For Japanese, the story is even more troubling. It exposes the lies of wartime propaganda, but also raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of the society that told those lies, and about why so many chose to believe them. The women themselves largely disappeared from history. Most married, raised families, and lived quiet lives in post-war Japan. Few spoke publicly about their experiences. When researchers in later decades tracked down survivors and asked them about the phrase "paradise on Earth," many were reluctant to confirm or deny it. The reality, they explained, was more complex than any simple phrase could capture. Yes, the material conditions had been better than expected, dramatically better. Yes, they had been treated with a humanity that contradicted everything they had been taught. But paradise seemed too strong a word for confinement, for separation from loved ones, for the psychological dissolution of watching everything you believed prove false. And yet, in private moments, some would acknowledge that there had been a kind of liberation in that captivity. Liberation from the crushing pressure of imperial expectations. Liberation from the requirement to sacrifice everything for a cause that proved hollow. Liberation from propaganda that infantilized and deceived. One woman, interviewed in 1983 at the age of 67, put it this way: "We lost the war but found ourselves. Behind that wire, fed and safe and treated like human beings, we were more free than we had ever been in Japan." The deeper truth embedded in this story transcends the specific circumstances of World War II. It speaks to the power of material abundance and ideological openness in ways that authoritarian systems can never fully counter. The Japanese Empire could control information, could saturate its population with propaganda, could enforce conformity through violence. But it could not create the genuine prosperity and individual dignity that American prisoners experienced once they saw past the lies. You cannot fake abundance. You cannot pretend your way to the kind of casual generosity that gives chocolate to captured enemies. You cannot manufacture the institutional commitment to human rights that ensures prisoners receive medical care and fair treatment. This is why totalitarian systems eventually fail. Not because their propaganda is insufficiently sophisticated, but because propaganda ultimately cannot substitute for reality. The Japanese military could tell its soldiers that Americans were devils, but when those soldiers became prisoners and encountered actual Americans, the cognitive dissonance became unsustainable. The Nazi regime could preach racial superiority while starving and murdering millions, but the material and moral bankruptcy of such a system was evident to anyone who experienced or witnessed it directly. The Soviet Union could trumpet its workers' paradise while its citizens lined up for bread, but everyone knew the truth behind the facade. The female Japanese POWs who called American camps paradise were not naive or brainwashed. They were people who had been lied to their entire lives and suddenly encountered a reality that contradicted those lies in every particular. Their testimony is powerful not because it flatters American virtue. The United States has its own catalog of sins and failures, but because it demonstrates the ultimate fragility of systems built on fear, deception, and deprivation. You can control people through such means, but only until they glimpse an alternative. And then, as these women discovered, the entire structure of lies becomes visible and begins to crumble. In the end, the story returns to that transport ship in January 1945, to Miyako Yamashita clutching her cyanide capsule and preparing for horrors that never came. In that moment, she was the product of a system that valued death over truth, sacrifice over survival, collective mythology over individual experience. She had been trained to fear capture more than death itself. But in the months that followed, she experienced something more subversive than any military defeat: the discovery that the enemy was human, that abundance need not be hoarded, that dignity could be afforded even to those who fought against you. She returned to Japan in late 1945 and lived until 1998. She married, raised 3 children, worked as a nurse in a Yokohama hospital. She rarely spoke of her time as a prisoner of war. But she kept among her possessions, until the day she died, a wooden comb given to her by an American nurse at the hospital where she had worked on Oahu. It was a simple thing, inexpensive, probably purchased at a drugstore for a few cents. But it represented to her something more valuable than any propaganda could convey: the possibility of connection across the deepest divides, the power of ordinary kindness in extraordinary circumstances, and the resilient human capacity to recognize truth when confronted with it, no matter how many lies we have been taught to believe. Paradise is not a place. It is the moment when the scales fall from our eyes and we see clearly what has always been true: that we are all human, that cruelty is a choice, that abundance shared multiplies while abundance hoarded diminishes, and that the most radical act of all is to treat our enemies with the dignity we wish for ourselves. The Japanese women who discovered this truth behind the wire of American POW camps were not weak or traitorous. They were perhaps the most courageous, because they were willing to abandon comfortable lies for uncomfortable truths, to revise their understanding of the world when evidence demanded it, and to carry that knowledge forward into an uncertain future. This is the inheritance they left, not a simple tale of good versus evil, but more complex meditation on the nature of truth, the power of lived experience over propaganda, and the enduring human hunger for authenticity in a world that constantly tries to deceive us. In an age that seems increasingly defined by competing narratives and weaponized information, their story reminds us that reality eventually asserts itself, that lies have an expiration date, and that the truth, however inconvenient or complicated, is always worth seeking.